right, so we are in the book of Haggai, although I'm not going to be reading from the book of Haggai this morning. I am going to be preaching from another text, but it's within this theme or within this series of being stirred up, that God is able to do something in our lives and in our hearts that allows us to partner with Him and live in relationship with Him with a fullness and with a grace that comes from heaven, which changes how we live. And so last week we spoke about the fact that God is a covenantal God. He has obligated Himself to us. He has, through covenant, said, "You will be my people, and I will be your God, and I will never leave you. I will never forsake you." This beautiful covenantal language that we see all through Scripture. And what He's saying to this remnant, because we've got a group of Israelites, 50,000 of them that have been exiled. They've come back to Jerusalem because there's been some changes in Babylon. They've been taken over by Persia, and God moves in the heart of the Persian king to release them, and they can go back home, but more importantly, they can go back to the presence of God. Because Jerusalem was always the place that signified the presence of God. And in particular, the temple of God was where He would dwell with His people. And so they're all very excited, and they head back to Jerusalem. They make this journey from the east, from Babylon, the very same path that Abraham walked from Ur, the place where he grew up. Ur. He was never quite sure about where he grew up. But he made the exact same journey all the way to the promised land, to Canaan, and in particular to Jerusalem, is where these Israelites came back, and they had an opportunity to dwell with their God again. And so they get there, they're excited, they settle, they land, and the first thing they do is they build an altar, which is exactly what Abraham did. When he arrived, he pitched his tent and he built an altar. So it's kind of like this repeat of what happened previously. And they build an altar, and they're very excited about rebuilding the temple, but then there's some opposition that comes. And they a little bit thrown by the fact that this temple that they're going to be building is not going to be as majestic as the temple of Solomon's day, and they're a little bit disheartened by it, and a couple of things creep in, and distractions and things of the world and their own lives start to take priority, and all of a sudden, deep apathy kicks in. Apathy for the things of God. Indifference to the purposes of God. Why? Because I'm just going to live my life. And God is saying, but I'm your God, and you are my people. We get to dwell together. And the temple that I've asked you to rebuild is the symbolic, it was real, it was a material thing, it was a place, it was a physical place, but it was the place where He was saying, this is the very dwelling. This is where I get to be with you, my people. And if it's in ruins, what does that say about our relationship? I haven't stopped loving you. My side of this covenantal agreement is still in place. What's up with your side? And He's talking about their paneled homes. They've used the wood that the Persian king actually donated for the rebuilding of the temple, and they've paneled their own homes with it. So the resources that God put in their hands, they actually used for their own benefit, as opposed to building this beautiful temple that would signify where they could be in community with one another, but with God in particular. So this apathy kicks in, this indifference kicks in, and zeal for God's house wanes. And like I said, there's this golden thread all the way through of covenant. The covenant with Abraham is shown by virtue of the fact that they cover the exact same journey that Abraham covered, and he's the father of their faith. And they also build the altar. And then the Mosaic covenant, which was the covenant that came through Moses, You just read that whole account and how it kind of works into Deuteronomy and Leviticus. There's a whole bunch of things that speaks about the blessings that come with obedience to the covenant and curses that come with the disobedience of the covenant. And actually, Haggai is reminding them of all those things. He's saying, like, hey, well, there's drought and, you're not seeing the fruit of your hands. There's a whole bunch of things that's happening. There's a reason for that. And God is, in his wisdom and in his love, actually withholding. Like, there's something from heaven that's, the gates are not quite open in terms of a flow because they are not in the place that they should be, and he's not going to perpetuate that kind of behavior. He's getting their attention. But this Mosaic covenant finds its way into the story. And then obviously one of the central characters is this man called Zerubbabel, or as I call him, Saragbibel. And he's the only surviving guy from David's lineage. And he's the one that would make sure that the lineage is going to continue, and that's where Jesus is going to come from. So the fulfillment of covenant is in this seed and the lineage of the king. He's not the king in this context, but he's called the governor because there's already a king, the king of Persia. But because he is in the line, he's referred to as the governor, and he is the line of this covenant fulfillment. And so covenant is all over. And there's 34 references to the name Yahweh in 38 verses. Yahweh is God's covenantal name. So we got to know that this whole setting is one of God in covenant with his people, but as far as how they are together in this beautiful covenantal relationship, God is faithful to them, but they're not as faithful to him. And so he's getting their attention. And this prophetic word of Haggai comes into this context. And covenant is an amazing thing as far as a definition for it. Multiple definitions out there, but one that I really like says this: a covenant is an unchangeable, divinely imposed legal agreement between God and man that stipulates the conditions of their relationship. So it's unchangeable, which means it's a lasting reality. It's forever. When God is involved, when God comes into a covenantal relationship, it's a lasting agreement. The word agreement is used really to show that there's two parties involved. But it's not to say that because it's an agreement, our side of this covenant gives us room to negotiate with God. We don't decide on the terms, he does, which is why it's divinely imposed. So he sets the covenant, he sets the terms of that covenant, and our options is either to accept it or to reject it. We don't come into this with a, hey, but what about these terms? I mean, you've heard a lot of that, I'm sure, in Christian circles, in teachings. You know, when teaching starts to shift a little bit away from God's word, and it starts to sound like, hey, this is maybe a life that we can live and relate to God in this way, because we want to see God in this way. Because if we see God in this way, it suits us, suits our way of living. You know, let him just be a God that blesses us, and we live in this incredible prosperity, and we live for ourselves. And, you know, so like we're not changing the terms of the contract of this covenantal agreement. It's not for changing. It's not. It's not up for negotiation. God sets it, and he says, you have an option of either accepting it or rejecting it. And at the heart of this promise, God is constantly saying, I will be their God, and they will be my people. Which, I mean, we've got to understand, we are scoring massively. You do get that. It's not like, oh, let me give it a little bit of thought. Like, for you to reject this, you must know what you're rejecting. But to accept it. I mean, if you think of a landlord and a tenant, and there's agreement between the two of them, but the landlord owns this incredible mansion with amazing views, and it's like, you know, walking distance to the beach, and it's like the most idyllic space. And the landlord says, you know what? You can stay for free. Just be here. Because it works for me that you occupy this space. But don't worry about the gardens, I'll arrange for services. Don't worry about cleaning, I'll get someone in to do that. You just be here. And then the tenant's kind of like, yeah, I don't know. Not so sure. I like camping. I mean, you're getting the analogy. It's kind of like the covenantal agreement that God offers to us is so good. I mean, that analogy would never measure, but I'm just illustrating the point that we would say, I'm not so sure. You don't know what you're saying no to. You don't realize the beauty of what God is actually putting before us. And so to illustrate that, I want to read from 2 Samuel 9, which is a story of rescue, and it's rescuing someone through covenantal faithfulness. So it's a story of a guy by the name of Mephibosheth. Everyone say that with me. Mephibosheth. No, loud. Say it. Mephibosheth. Just trying to give you some insights into the task at hand here. It's not easy. It says, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Very interesting way of phrasing things. I want to show kindness to someone to the house of Saul, anyone who comes from the house of Saul. The reason why I want to do it is because of Jonathan. Okay, so what is going on here? There's characters. David, Jonathan, Saul. Saul is the king of Israel, and his son, Jonathan, next in line. But they both die on the battlefield. And because of God's anointing on David, and because he is ordained for him to be king, David steps in as the new king. And so David is asking this question with both Saul and his son Jonathan dead. And he's saying, anyone from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness. When a new king would come into being, and it wasn't from the family line, it was common knowledge that that family needed to make a beeline. They needed to get out of there. Because risk mitigation for the new king would be, we're going to wipe out the entire household of the previous king. No one's going to come and try and dethrone me. No one's going to come and try and take this seat from me. So we're going to kill all the descendants of the previous king. And the nanny of Mephibosheth, who was at the time 5 years old, knows about this. And so she picks him up and they run. Well, she runs. She picks him up, runs out of the royal palace, and is trying to take him to a place of safety before David makes his way into the palace. This is a little bit sooner in 1 Samuel. And there's an incident. She stumbles, falls, and she drops him. And as a result of the fall, he's crippled in both his feet. And he lands up in a place called Lodibar, which is east of Jerusalem. And it's a place where he is exiled, and he's outside of the presence of the king, outside of Jerusalem, his home where he should be, and he's taken to a place called Lodibar, which means barrenness, and there he lives the life of a refugee, and he's crippled in both his legs. And he's scared of the king that has come into play, because obviously he's been told, this is why what happened to you actually happened. We were running because this king would actually just want to kill you. So it's best that you get away from this. And through the whole process, he's crippled. He's living in Lodibar. And it says in verse 2, now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David. And the king said to him, are you Ziba? At your service, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? See, David's not letting up on this. He is persisting, and he is asking anyone from the house of Saul, I want to show them God's kindness. Now, God's kindness is more than human kindness. It's a love that goes beyond what comes naturally for a human. That's the kind of kindness that David wants to show. And the word that's used to describe it is chesed, spelled C-H-E-S-E-D. Chesed. as we would potentially say in South Africa. He chesed me. But it's not chesed, it's chesed. I preached on it once, and the guy came to me after and said, "Oh, sorry, it's not actually chesed, it's chesed." I said, "That's what I said." He wasn't buying it. But it's speaking about God's loving kindness, speaking about his covenantal love. And it's a love that is characterized by deep devotion, a steadfast love, a faithful commitment to the other. It's a state of being passionately dedicated, in love with and loyal to another person. Descriptions that I've picked up on how chesed is described and explained. There's a couple of things that I wrote down here. It says chesed is the combining of the warmth of God's fellowship and the security of God's faithfulness. It's the encompassing of deeds of mercy performed by a more powerful party for the benefit of a weaker one. Chesed presupposes the existence of a relationship between the parties involved. Where no formal relationship has previously been recognized, the person exercising chesed has chosen to treat the recipient as if such a relationship did exist. Chesed is not merely love, but loyal love. Not merely kindness, but dependable kindness. Not merely affection, but affection that has committed itself. And so when David says, I want to show anyone from the house of Saul God's kindness, he's saying, I want to show them chesed. I want to show them this kind of love, this dedicated, committed, faithful, deep devotion, passionate love for the good of the other. Someone who is weaker than I, and I have the means and the power to love them in a way that their lives would be changed forever. And he's asking, is there anyone left of the house of Saul that I can do this to? It's the complete opposite of what everyone thought this new king would do with the household of Saul. Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodebar. So King David had him brought from Lodebar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. The ESV says, then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir. The double action. There's a going after him and there's a bringing him in. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth. If I was David, I would probably at that point in time say, do you mind if I call you Fib? Do we have to do this Mephibosheth the whole time? At your service, he replied. At your service. It's the kind of thing you say to a king, right? It's the kind of thing you say to a king that you think is going to kill you and has called you in for that end. See, he doesn't know what David wants to show him. And so his words to the king is at your service. Whatever I can do to prevent you from killing me, I will do that. I'm at your service. What Mephibosheth didn't know is that Jonathan, his father, and David had actually entered into a covenant. Jonathan saw the writing on the wall. He realized the gifting of David. He realized the anointing of God on David. And he realized that invariably David would be king and he wouldn't. So he approached David and he said, would you be willing? I mean, they were close friends. But would you be willing to enter into a covenant with me? And David, in his heart, felt that was the right thing to do. And so they entered into a covenant. And that covenant looked like this. They would start by facing one another. So one would be standing on one end, and it would be in front of people. It would be a public thing. And the other person would stand on the other side, and they would face one another. And then they would start by taking their belts off, and they would exchange belts. And the belt was something that carried your weaponry, your sword, and whatever you had as far as your means to protect. And so you would take that off and exchange it, and you'd be saying with that, all of my ability to defend and protect, I give to you. And then they would take their robes off, And robes in biblical times was kind of signifying who you were as a person. So if you took your robe off and you gave it to someone, what you were saying in that motion is, all of who I am, I give to you. So belt comes off, robe comes off, and there's an exchanging of it. And that they would put the other person's robe on and belt on. And this oneness would come into this beautiful covenantal relationship where they committed to one another in a way that they were saying, my identity is yours. Yours is mine. We're wrapped up in this, in one. And my ability to defend and your ability to defend comes together, that we are both looked after. Beautiful reality. And then there would be an exchanging of names. And they would take the last name and they'd make it their middle name, and vice versa. And so the exchanging of names would come into play as well. You can start to see some of the parallels with marriage covenant. Also covenant. And then there would be cutting of animals where it would be like sawn in half this way. And the one half would be on the one side and the other half would be on the other side. And there would be a slight little valley between, like a little incline. And the blood from these two animal pieces would flow to the middle. And what they would do as covenantal partners in their commitment to one another and in ratifying this, they would walk around the animal piece in a figure 8, both of them, and then they would meet one another in the middle. And as they walked around the animal piece, they would say out loud, if I break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. They would then cut their palms and they would shake their hands, where like shaking of hands comes from that. It's a covenantal reality. So their hands would come together, and the cutting of their palms, there would be like an intermingling of blood. You've got to love the Bible. You've got to love ancient times. We've got it easy nowadays. We just put a ring on the finger. Woo. This was real. This was raw. And then they would take wood ash and they would rub it into the scar, because it would make a prominent scar. They wanted a scar. They wanted it to be obvious. And it was obvious so that they could put their hand up. If anyone came near to them, there was a reminder. If you take on me, you're not just taking on me. You're taking on my covenantal partner. And it would be a reminder for themselves. Just like this is a reminder. I'm in covenant. And they would then plant a tree, and they would sprinkle that tree with blood. I'm not sure they knew what they were doing in the moment and why they were doing it. But God ordained, and He led them in a way, because He knew there would be one day a tree that would be covered with blood. And then they would have a meal together, and they would eat bread, and they would drink wine, and this covenant would be ratified. And this is what happened between David and Jonathan. So what did this mean for Mephibosheth? For Phoebe? Verse 7, don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. You're understanding why now he says, I want to show you kindness, but for the sake of your father, for the sake of Jonathan. Because in entering into that covenant, it was, this is true for you and yours, all of who belongs to you. And then says, I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. What an incredible promise. This king that's meant to be the tyrant that would kill, actually is showing chesed. And Mephibosheth is offered this incredible relationship of covenant. All of what happened between David and Jonathan now becomes true for Mephibosheth. The taking off of the belt, the taking off of the robe, the coming and communing with one another. David says, don't be afraid. He's saying it because there's no reason for you to be scared. There is no cause for anxiety. He's saying, I know you're expecting the worst, but actually I'm about to give you my best. I'm about to show you covenantal kindness. I'm about to shower you with chesed. You're about to experience my deep devotion. And I'm going to extend mercy to you. And we are going to enjoy warm fellowship. And you're going to have the security of this palace. The security of a royal family. I'm going to treat you as a son. Actually, I'm going to treat you as if you've always been my son. Because chesed presupposes a new relationship that has actually always been there. It's how it happens. And it's for the sake of your father, Jonathan. See, none of this is based on you. None of it is based on your efforts. This isn't a covenant based on your merit. This is a covenant based on the merit of another. It's because of covenant, the covenant that was cut before you were even born, that you now have a new identity, that you are now the son of the King, and that you have unwavering and unchanging protection and provision, a new life. It's not on your merit, it's on the merit of another. It's not on what you've done. It's based on covenant that happened before you were even born. What a glorious truth. And then he says, and you'll always eat at my table. It's always unchanging, unending. It's this new status that he has found. And he receives this incredible inheritance. It's like, I'm going to restore all the land to you, and you will always eat at my table. This guaranteed assurance of an inheritance. Then it goes on to say, Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Sounds a lot like the psalmist, when the psalmist wrote, what is man that you are mindful of him? With dead dogs. Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. See, Mephibosheth was enjoying the full effects of being adopted into a royal family. There was a fullness to his life. And it wasn't by virtue of anything he had did. And it also wasn't because there was any lack in David's life. He had sons. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. But I love that last little inclusion, like a little footnote. Excuse the pun. He was lame in both feet. Like, don't forget, he's a cripple. But Mephibosheth experiences a profound transformation. He goes from being in exile to being welcomed into a royal family. He goes from acting like a servant to being adopted as a son. He goes from being unable because of his crippled state to all of a sudden having the resources of the king behind him. I mean, David's just like, hey, Ziba, all your sons, all your servants, you serve him. And his crippled state gets covered by the king's table. And there he sits and no one can see his crippledness. He goes from having a hopeless future to being given an assured inheritance. Your future's changed, Mephibosheth. He goes from fearing the king's wrath to resting in the chesed of the king. And all of that is achieved on the merit of covenant. Not between David and Mephibosheth, but between David and Jonathan. It was established before Mephibosheth was even born. And I mean, I think Mephibosheth grew up with a knowledge that things weren't right. For one, he didn't have his biological father. His biological father was absent. And then his covenantal father stepped in, and everything in his life changed. His covenantal father sent for him and brought him in. And radically changed his identity. I think if you'd ask the question, what would a response from Mephibosheth look like? It would have to be one of deep gratitude. joyful thanksgiving and living the fullness of the life that had been presented to him. Anything less would be frowned upon, right? Can you imagine David would say on a particular day, hey guys, where's Mephibosheth? Oh, he decided to sleep in. Okay. Not going to sit with us. Maybe once, twice. Oh, a month, 2 years, whatever. Like, where's he? Ah, he's off doing his own thing. Do you see how, it's so dishonoring of this covenantal relationship that David would just say, this is the life I give you. Can you imagine him sitting at the table, but he's on his phone, distracted with the things of this world? Hey, Mephibosheth, what are you up to? No, I'm loading a couple of things on Gumtree. I left a few things in Lodibar, hoping to get some extra cash in. It's like, are you kidding me? Look around you. You're in a palace. Well, what do you need that for? You see how a slipping away from the fullness of a life that's been given makes absolutely no sense. And instead of acting like a son, he acts like a servant. Imagine how horrible that would be for David if he kept saying, hey, at your service, what can I do for you? It's like, oh, I've done everything for you. And instead of acting like royalty, he just lives like a commoner. Like, you've been brought into this. This is what you've been given. And if we look at the covenant that God enters into with Abraham, but actually with man. In Genesis 15, he says to Abraham, I am your shield, your very great reward. God was taking his belt off, and God was taking his robe off. All of my ability to protect and provide, I give to you. All of who I am, I give to you. I want to change your identity. And he renames, because they were Abram and Sarai, and he takes the H out of his name, Yahweh, which in the original vernacular was YHWH. And he puts his H into their name, and they become Abraham and Sarah. He breathes his life into this new relationship. And at the time of cutting this covenant, and the animal pieces are in place, before the walking between the animal pieces, what happens? God puts Abraham to sleep. He anesthetizes him. Why? Because he's not a part of this covenant cutting. And the scripture speaks about a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch moving between the animal pieces in this beautiful figure 8 configuration. That was Jesus in his divinity and Jesus in his humanity, because he is the mediator of this covenant. He's the one who represents God, and he's the one who represents us. And when the terms of the covenant was cut, and as we read for the rest of Scripture, we realize that those terms were set in a way where Jesus would say, if I break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. But if you break this covenant, may what's happened to this animal happen to me. So he would take responsibility on both ends. See, we are the breakers of the covenant. We're the ones that's crippled. We're Mephibosheth. We put the me back in Mephibosheth. That's us. He was hung on a tree, and his blood was poured out for us, sprinkled. And his hands were marked with the indelible marks of covenant. It's what he showed Thomas. Look at my hands. And he sat down with the disciples after he had been raised from the dead, and he had a meal with them. And he said, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. See, all of this was established without human intervention. Abraham was asleep and we weren't yet born. And this covenant was created. And the Father sends his Son. There's a going after. And then he draws us in. So even Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. You see this chesed of God, this loving kindness, this relentless pursuit of us. He never stops. He never fails in his faithfulness to us. Even when we are distant, even when we drift, even when we don't put the things of God first, when we don't put him first, when he's not in the center of our lives, and somehow we just find a new life where we put him in the margins because it suits us. He never stops loving us in this covenantal way. In Isaiah 49, verse 16, it says the following. It's God speaking. He says, see, I've inscribed you on the palms of my hands. See, those marks are not just marks, they're personal because it's been extended to us. I've inscribed you in the palms of my hands. And then it says, your walls are continually before me. You know what that means? Your walls is our lives. That which fortifies us, that which brings us safety, that which allows us to live. It's our future. Your walls are ever before me, he says. I've inscribed you in the palm of my hands. Your walls are ever before me. You know what he's saying? It's like, you don't have to worry about your walls. You just come in the fullness of this relationship. You live as a son, as a daughter, because I have won this for you. I have made it possible for you to be in a relationship. I've brought you from exile. And your crippled state has been covered by my table. And you get to live in communion with me. My warm fellowship and my steadfast love is true for you. And the invitation that he is extending to the Israelites is he's saying, you've drifted from this covenantal relationship. You're focusing on your own walls. He's saying, come and build my house that I may dwell with you. I will look after your walls. You build my house, I'll look after your house. Because that's the kind of God he is. Do you realize just how beautiful this invitation is? That we get to live on the receiving end of a covenantal love, a loving kindness that we will experience from no one else. And it's given to us freely, and all we get to do is accept it or reject it. But if we accept it, can we live in the fullness of it? Not worried about our own lives, not worried about our own walls. We get to live in response to this glorious grace that comes from the throne of heaven. King Jesus welcomes us in, and he says, you can sit with me at my table. All of this was done for you, on your behalf, before you were even born.